After our first season in the Caribbean, it was time to decide where we would spend the hurricane season. In general, it was safe to be within 10 to 12 degrees north or south of the equator. A lot of cruisers chose to go south to Grenada, Trinidad, or Venezuela. But one of the US cruisers suggested we go north. If we chose that option, he recommended going directly as far north as we could. Apparently, the cruise back down the east coast of the USA would be slow, with both the winds and the currents against us. We thought this was a great idea. If we arrived in Maine in May, Poco Andante would have a full year to get back to the southern end of the Caribbean before the next hurricane season. The voyage from Puerto Rico to Bermuda would take about 10 days, directly through the Bermuda Triangle, followed by about 6 days to Maine. Wind and sea conditions for the trip would probably be better later in April than earlier, so we returned to Culebra to make sure we and the boat were both ready for another ocean passage. It was farewell to the Caribbean on the 29th of April, after spending nearly 3 warm, sunny and fun-filled months there. As we motored out of Culebra, one of the other yachts called us on the radio and said, "Why are you leaving? I wouldn't go. The lumpy seas would make me seasick." Was this a good idea? We had spent the previous 3 weeks, firstly in a lagoon a couple of miles outside Culebra town, doing some varnishing work. Of course, the work was interspersed with snorkeling, sightseeing and generally lazing around. We then moved closer to Culebra town so that we could provision for our trip north to the US. There was a good cheap ferry from Culebra to the mainland Puerto Rico, about an hour and a half trip away. Complete with 4 holdalls and our trusty granny trolley, we loaded up with essentials at the large supermarket just out of town. We also topped up the water tanks from the dinghy dock, the local bar. Next we had to wait for a weather window. We were looking for a high pressure just forming over Bermuda. In theory, this would give us easterly trade winds up to Bermuda and settled conditions when we approached the island. After a few days of waiting and a few happy hours at the dinghy dock, we had time to study the weather maps downloaded from the internet. And finally, with one last drink at the bar and promises to return, we decided to leave the next day. The wind was blowing the forecast east 18 to 20 knots in the harbour, but once we rounded the island, Poco Andante hit the full brunt of the wind and the waves. After having been in harbour for about a month or so, it was a bit of a shock. A short discussion ensued. Do we turn around and wait for another week to carry on? The decision hinged on Henry the hydrovane. If he could keep our course, then we would continue. Henry is a type of automatic steering mechanism which sails the boat at a particular angle to the wind. Fortunately, Henry coped really well, and so on we went. For the first 3 days, we were close hauled with 18 knots of wind. It's not much fun living at 15 to 20 degrees of heel and being lurched about inside the boat every time you went down below. Crashing through the seas, breaking over the bow, revealed a leak in the V-berth hatch. This was very annoying. We had yet to find the ideal sealant for this hatch. As an interim measure, we used duct tape to minimise the leaks. As an aside, it wasn't until we were in Australia several years later that we were introduced to a sealant used on high-rise buildings on the window installations, and we finally achieved a permanent solution for this very exposed hatch. We had about 4 pleasant days of beam reaching about 10 to 15 knots, followed by one yuck day of about 20 to 30 knot headwinds. We ended up motoring for this last 6 hours to get into port in daylight. Sailing-wise, these conditions weren't a problem. We'd set Henry as we cleared Culebra and didn't touch him again for 3 days. And then we let the sails out, adjusted Henry a bit, and the next day the pole went up. 3 days later it came down and we were close hauled again. A small depression developed over Bermuda, which we hit about 30 miles out. Bermuda Coast Guard monitors the radar and had picked us up, which was reassuring. They were able to talk us into St. George's Harbour to avoid a cruise ship that was just leaving. Although our electronic charts appeared to be accurate, we didn't actually have a cruising guide showing the entrance to Bermuda. The island is surrounded by a huge reef with lots of wrecks, and the channels are fairly narrow. Bermuda was colonised by British shipwrecked sailors. It's a real gem of a place. Everyone was very friendly, and the town of St. George is pretty and dates back to the 17th century, with lots of original houses, all adorned with white roofs, because the roofs are the main water catchment area. It was also a little cooler than in the Caribbean, which was refreshing, but it was still sunny and warm. St. George's Harbour was a hive of activity at this time of year, with sailing boats arriving and preparing for the trip back across the Atlantic via the Azores. Bermuda was a welcome break for us as we waited for the right weather to continue our journey north. The weather window came sooner than expected, so we had to cut short our visit and head out. Bermuda is in the horse latitudes, where a high-pressure system with no wind can settle in for weeks. Ancient mariners, running out of water, often sacrificed their horses in order to survive, hence the name the horse latitudes. We were waiting for such a high, as this creates settled weather all the way up to Maine. Not having any horses to throw overboard, we just made use of our 75 horsepower engine and motored for 2 days through the calm centre of the high until we hit the westerlies on the other side. A major navigational hazard is the Gulf Stream current that can flow up to 3 knots easterly, taking the warm Caribbean water in a clockwise path around the North Atlantic to the UK. Monitoring the water temperature was an excellent navigational aid in this part of the world, and what a shock crossing the Gulf Stream was. As we approached, we were in tropical waters around 24 degrees C, with lots of flying fish and stuff. There was a jump to about 28 degrees as we entered the Gulf Stream, which was about 50 or 60 miles across, and flowing at about 2 to 3 knots. The water then dropped to 16 degrees in the space of 2 to 3 miles, reaching a low of 8 degrees as we approached the US coast. This brought cold winds and grey seas, a big shock having to put clothes on again. 200 miles out, we hit our first major fog bank. No wind and visibility down to 1 mile. We were now running short of diesel. The price of diesel in Bermuda was so expensive that Keith had refused to completely fill the tanks. We decided to run the engine for 6 hours in the hope that we would motor through the centre of the high pressure to pick up wind on the other side. Luckily, we picked up a light 5-knot breeze from the south, so that we set the Jenica and achieved 3 knots through the water. We maintained this for most of the night. I was on watch and Keith was below asleep. He woke to my call through the hatch for some help. 6 months previously, raising the Jenica at all was a cause for major debate. Now I was at the helm in 20 knots of wind, full main and Jenica, doing 8.5 knots through the water. I'd certainly come a long way. We had been unable to buy any cruising guides for the US in the Caribbean and relied on our electronic charts for the passage to Maine. The World Cruising Handbook by Jimmy Cornell advised that Portland was the recommended port of entry for Maine, but we actually wanted to start our exploration further north. So we looked at the Lonely Planet Guide to the US, and it showed that there was a ferry which travels between Bar Harbor in Maine and Nova Scotia in Canada. So we figured there had to be a customs and immigration there. We set our course for Bar Harbor. Still under Jenica and low on fuel, we needed to eyeball the fairway buoy at the entrance to Bar Harbor to check the accuracy of our electronic charts. Despite the fog, we were delighted to find it exactly where it should be, and we could now drop the Jenica and change course for our destination. We slowly headed towards the harbour, but visibility was down to about 400 metres. The town map in the Lonely Planet Guide showed what looked like a ferry terminal, but when we approached it, there was no sign of activity at all, and certainly no sign of any other boats. We turned back and tried calling on the VHF radio, hopeful rather than expectant, but we were delighted when we heard a deep male voice. "This is the Bar Harbor Harbour Master." Quite a mouthful. We inquired about where we could anchor, and he said, "Come in the entrance until you see the wall, and you'll find some moorings you can pick up." The fog was now so thick that we couldn't even see the entrance, but thankfully he could see us on radar and gave us a heading to come in on. Sure enough, when we could see the harbour wall, we also saw the moorings. The harbour master called again. "Poco Andante, do you need to clear into the US of A?" "Yes, please. Come ashore and we'll take you around there." So, despite being cold and tired after our 6-day passage, we had to launch the dinghy, attach the outboard, gather our paperwork and head ashore. The harbour master kindly drove us around to the ferry terminal, which was the one we'd identified, and he pointed us in the direction of the offices with an offer to come back and pick us up when we were ready. We entered the deserted terminal building and poked our noses into various offices until we found the customs and immigration people. It turned out that the ferry service wouldn't start for that season for another 2 days, and they were just setting up the offices and checking that the systems all worked. We were their first clients for the year. They were very surprised to find a British yacht arriving so early in the year. It turns out that the US leisure sailors don't start their sailing season until June or July. One of their staff kindly drove us back to the harbour master's office, and we returned to the yacht for a well-deserved drink. The harbour master later offered us the use of his cruising guide to the east coast, on the condition that we posted it back when we had finished with it. Such generosity was overwhelming and not at all uncommon. As an aside, we did actually return it. We posted it back from Key West about 6 months later. We got a real surprise the next morning when we woke up to a glorious sunny day. We could see the bar, which extended out from the harbour and culminating in a huge granite mini mountain. It turned out that the ferry terminal was on the second harbour on the other side of the bar, so we weren't far out in our reckoning. There were some lovely classic yachts in the harbour, and the hills were covered in pine trees. Our stay in Bar Harbour was a great introduction to Maine. It was lively, everyone very friendly and willing to spend time to stand and chat. It was still early in the season. Maine doesn't really wake up from their winter until the first week of June. The population then trebles until September, when all the vacationers go home. Lots of stores, leafy streets, white clapboard houses, etc. This we thought was great. If all the towns of Maine were like this, we would enjoy our stay. After 3 days of brilliant sunshine, we set sail to explore the coast and islands, thousands of them, all with well-buoyed passages through the cuts and lobster pots everywhere. This kept us on our toes. Our first anchorage in backwoods Maine was Somes Sound, a fjord-like inlet typical of the coast. Very picturesque. A 10-minute walk around the village did Somes Sound. 2 churches and a bookshop was its claim to fame. The next day took us to Southwest Harbour, a working harbour with lobster boats and lobster piers where you could buy fresh lobsters everywhere. Southwest Harbour was also the first place where Poco could come alongside for diesel. We'd managed to get a couple of jerry cans filled in Bar Harbour, but we seriously needed to fill the tanks. When we got there, A, the tide was way down and we couldn't get in, and B, the fuel dock was still not fully functioning due to the icy cold of winter. Again, we had to resort to jerry cans to get 360 litres of fuel. From here we headed to Penobscot Bay, a huge inlet dotted with islands and harbours. Many of the rocks were covered with seals basking in the weak sunlight. By now the sun had given way to light drizzle and fog. Lots of this in Maine. Wildlife and wilderness is what Maine does well. Eagles and ospreys fly overhead, seals and dolphins swim freely, and seabirds everywhere. We visited Stonington, which has an opera house in the middle of this tiny town. Castine, another brief wet visit. It was a Sunday and we didn't see a soul. And then across to Camden, a very lively town. We spent a few days here, and interestingly, we met a couple who were touring the US in an RV. Comparing our lifestyles revealed huge similarities, managing fuel, electricity and water. Then it was on to Rockland. After a 10-minute walk around this sleepy town, we decided to move on to Booth Bay. Harbour itself is protected by outlying granite islets, some with the typical picturesque lighthouses that one sees along this coast. We anchored in the lee of one of these islands and enjoyed splendid views of the shoreline, culminating in a magnificent white clapboard church with soaring steeple bathed in the setting sunlight. We loved Booth Bay, a lovely mixture of working lobster port and tourist area. We were welcomed and entertained by the lobstermen there and learned so much from them about their work and lifestyle. Keith had his first ever Maine lobster dinner, followed by copious amounts of mudslide, a frozen smoothie of vodka, Kahlua and cream. I couldn't enjoy the lobsters because of my allergy to shellfish, but I did enjoy the mudslides. We left Penobscot Bay and did our own whale watch cruise, sailing and motoring about 25 to 30 miles out in the sunshine and clear visibility. We were not disappointed. Saw 2 huge finbacks about 12 to 15 metres long, and they were hunting, and they gave us a great display, rounding up schools of fish and then lunging at them from the decks. Keith was on the bow taking photos and I was on the helm when I saw a huge whale approaching Poco Andante right on the beam. It turned on its side and the whale and I exchanged looks. before it silently swam down beneath the keel and appeared on the other side. It was scary to think what would have happened if it had flicked its huge tail. We decided we wouldn't do our own whale watching after that. New England teems with heritage. It seems that every house in town has a plaque or story on public display. Everything looked pristine in the early midsummer sunshine. Tales of first settlers, sea captains, famous politicians, revolution and civil war abound. There was a huge sense of community spirit and community pride, which was reflected in clean and tidy towns, well-maintained gardens, lots of public spaces, statues, wonderful buildings, and enviable large houses. New England is a really prosperous part of the US. From the sailing point of view, it was great. The seas were flat and there were lots of anchorages. For some reason, the American sailors avoid anchoring and prefer to pick up moorings. These are numerous and by our standards expensive just for the mooring. You don't get any shore facilities. The winds were light or from the wrong direction, so we motored a lot. Fog was always close at hand, but the channels are well marked and visibility was really less than half a mile, so it wasn't a real problem. Port in Maine. A big city at last. We took a local bus to a huge shopping mall and did a small resupply and enjoyed just wandering around window shopping. An historic village where early American houses are open to the public. We also met up with Captain Chuck Quinlan, who was moored close to us off the naval base there. A really colourful character who had sailed them extensively, including being part of the US Admiral's Cup team and had done a number of transatlantic races. He kindly took us on a car tour of Portsmouth and showed us all the sites of historic interest, including the site of the first battle of the Revolutionary War. Taking advantage of his generosity, we loaded up with beer and wine at the local store. New Hampshire is known for having no state tax, so it was a good place to stock up on diesel as well. We asked Chuck why all the vehicle number plates in New Hampshire were emblazoned with "Live Free or Die," which we found intriguing. He explained that the phrase comes from a toast written by General John Stark, New Hampshire's most famous soldier of the American Revolutionary War. He had been invited to an anniversary dinner, but had to decline due to ill health. Instead, he sent his toast by letter. Live free or die. Death is not the worst of evils. Has now been adopted as the official motto of New Hampshire. Poco Andante was anchored in a channel behind an island which had very strong currents and large tides, so we had laid fore and aft anchors. The area is strewn with lobster pots, so we were not surprised when the bow anchor snagged a pot. No real problem, except the fact that the lobster was undersized, so we didn't get a free lunch. After clearing the snag, we headed out to Gloucester, for an old whaling town, for a brief stop on our way to Boston, where we were looking forward to spending some time. Prior to Boston, we stopped off at Salem. Together with Marblehead just across the promontory, this is a huge boating area with thousands of moorings. At anchor again, we spent a lovely couple of days here touring the historic sites of the witch capital of the world. adjoining plaques, the first commemorating the witch jail, and the second commemorating the fact that the first plaque was originally located elsewhere. And to top all of this, a few doors further down, there was another plaque commemorating the fact that nothing happened here. We were also interested to discover that Salem had been a major sailing port and is considered one of the most significant seaports in Puritan American history. One benefit of being on a cruising yacht is that one can often visit large cities for longer periods than if you were paying for hotel accommodation. Often the harbour is a focal point of the city and provides facilities for visiting yachts. Boston is a prime example of this. The cruising guide indicated an anchorage area just off the Boston Harbour Hotel, right in the heart of downtown Boston. However, when we got there, the area was filled with moorings. I radioed the harbour master, who explained that some of the moorings belonged to the local yacht club, but that we were welcome to pick up one of the green public moorings at no charge, or anchor in the area marked on the chart. As the public moorings were all occupied, we carefully laid our anchor right on the edge of the marked anchorage field. The next day, we received a visit from the yacht club tender requesting payment for the mooring. We refused, and after a heated discussion, we pointed to the fact that we had an anchor chain out and the anchor ball marking the day mark. He finally accepted that we were not occupying one of their moorings and left. A few hours later, the harbour master came aboard to chat and gave us a big thumbs up for our accurate anchoring and flying the correct signals. We gathered that there had been ongoing discussions between the yacht club and the harbour master. It transpired that the Transat race, the single-handed race from Plymouth, UK to Boston, was just about to finish, so we stayed up to greet the finishing competitors. It was great fun cheering the boats as they arrived. Poco Andante was positioned just at the point where they stopped to drop their sails before proceeding to their berths about 100 metres away. We got up at 2 a.m. to welcome Mike Golding in, and even got away from Ellen MacArthur as she helped manoeuvre some of the boats in a rib. We were a bit disappointed she didn't come over to say hello, as we were the only boat in the harbour flying a British flag, and we were from her home port. We were also disappointed with Boston's reception of these intrepid sailors. Once the winning people had arrived, there didn't seem to be a great deal of interest or fanfare for the remaining competitors when they arrived. Our anchorage also gave us ringside seats to the once-a-year turnaround cruise of the USS Constitution, a revolutionary man of war. They sail down the harbour, complete with an all-guns broadside, an amazing sight, and then tie up to their dock facing the other way, hence the term turnaround. The event also commemorates the Battle of Bunker Hill, which was fought on June 17, 1775, during the Siege of Boston in the early stages of the American Revolutionary War. We enjoyed strolling around Boston, admiring the architecture of some of the older buildings. We also walked the Black Heritage Trail past homes, businesses, schools and churches of a thriving black community that were part of the Underground Railroad, a neat network of secret routes and safe houses established during the early to mid-19th century. It was used by enslaved African Americans primarily to escape into free states and from there to Canada. We also visited Harvard with its beautiful buildings and grounds. MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And of course, the site of the Boston Tea Party. Just as we were raising the anchor to leave Boston, the VHF announced an exclusion zone in the harbour and boats needed to get Coast Guard permission to move around the harbour. We duly sought and were given permission to leave and had just got underway when we suddenly lost all power on board. We hastily picked up an empty mooring and discovered the deck wash pump had burnt out and tripped the fuse box. A quick reset and we could proceed. At this time, 4 minesweepers came by sweeping the harbour. An interesting sight, but puzzling. So off we went, and about a mile down the harbour, we were approached by the harbour police launch with his blue light flashing. It turned out that our small delay had put us within the 1,000-metre exclusion zone for an LPG tanker coming into harbour. We were directed down a reserve channel, which looked very much like a container wharf to us, and told to wait until we got the all clear. The minesweepers, exclusion zone, etc. all come under the heading of Homeland Security, the continuing US reaction to 9/11. At Plymouth, we had to anchor a long way offshore due to shallow waters and dinghied ashore to visit the Rock, a piece of granite engraved 1620 and revered by the Americans. This was supposedly the first landfall of the Pilgrims. We walked around the town, which seemed composed of a large number of weatherboard houses. One amusingly numbered 84.5. Apart from its historical significance, there was not much more to warrant a long stay here. Our anchorage provided poor protection, and we endured an uncomfortable night's sleep. We made an early start to transit the Cape Cod Canal. The currents through the canal can get up to 5 to 6 knots. We timed our arrival at the entrance to ensure we had a following current. This was our first real canal and was somewhat disappointing. The sides are low and bushy, rather than the high imposing walls like the current canal. But its bridges were imposing to go under. From our perspective, we were sure the top of the mast wouldn't get through, despite being about 60 feet high and the bridge having clearance of about 500 feet. When you look up, the perspective is quite misleading and it's always a scary experience. Martha's Vineyard is a pretty holiday island in Nantucket Sound. The capital, Edgartown, is full of beautiful white clapboard houses, very picturesque. Oak Bluffs has a collection of weird and wonderful houses with bright colours and features like turrets and towers. From Martha's Vineyard, we went to Hadley Harbour, a lovely harbour on Naushon Island in Cape Cod Sound. It is located on the north end of the Elizabeth Islands and is owned by the Forbes family. The Forbes family is a wealthy, extended American family, long prominent in Boston, Massachusetts. The family's fortune originates from trading between North America and China in the 19th century. These privately owned islands retain their wild and free feeling. We took our inflatable dinghy through the well-marked channel, scarred by strong tides, to Woods Hole. We were fascinated to see that many of the channel markers were adorned with enormous osprey nests, many with chicks still being fed by their parents. Woods Hole is famous for the Oceanographic Institute, whose most famous member is Bob Ballard, the guy who discovered the wreck of the Titanic and the black smokers deep in the Pacific. They have some great exhibits and we thoroughly enjoyed our visit there. While at Hadley Harbour, we met some great people from the Red Brook Harbour Sailing Club. They were a really great crowd and were extremely hospitable and a credit to the sailing community. It was amazing to see how many people they could fit onto a Catalina 36 without capsizing it. It was great getting back into the party atmosphere again after our solitary sail along the Maine coast. We were sorry to see them go, but hoped to catch up with some of them again later. After our lovely weekend at Hadley Harbour, we sailed over to Newport, Rhode Island. The wind was a gentle southeasterly and we were welcomed by the ex-America's Cup sailing boats that were out on the bay. They certainly looked magnificent. Although there are many boats moored in Newport, there's a large anchorage off the Ida Lewis Sailing Club. This is a smaller sailing club than the prestigious New York Sailing Club right next door. There was lots of rivalry between them. The Ida Lewis scoring points for raising and lowering the Stars and Stripes first every day, complete with a cannon to mark the occasion. We stayed in Newport for the 4th of July celebrations and to do some shopping for boat bits, etc. Newport's old quaint streets are just great for ambling around, with many stores selling all sorts of things. Close to the harbour is one of the oldest baseball parks in America. 4th of July fell on a Sunday with a steady build-up the week before, so we decided to try and celebrate in the traditional US fashion. Firstly, on the Saturday evening we went to a baseball game, which for entertainment value was excellent, although the skill level compared to cricket could have been better. It is as complicated as cricket, but a bit faster, with innings only lasting about 15 minutes or so. Each of the 9 innings was interspersed with family entertainment, sack races for the mums, community singing, quizzes, etc. It was a great family day out. On the Sunday, 4th of July, we were up early to dress the ship overall, i.e. fly the signal flags to the top of the mast from the bow and the stern. Very pretty. We were pleased with ourselves when we realised we had beaten the Ida Lewis Sailing Club, although to be fair, they managed to get all their flags in a tangle. At lunchtime we took our 4th of July picnic over to Fort Adams to join the local population. The day was sunny and we had great fun watching all the people and chatting with the locals, some of whom were participating in the parade in Bristol the next day. The tradition was to have a huge fireworks display to mark the 4th of July, and this year's display in Newport was going to be bigger than normal. The Queen Mary cruise ship was due to arrive and had donated an extra $20,000 to the pot. Her arrival was magnificent and she dominated the skyline for the whole evening. Her original intention had been to go to New York, but she was refused entry due to the Homeland Security concerns. We partied into the night. At about 2 o'clock, as we motored back to Poco Andante, a little worse for wear, Keith spotted an inflatable and outboard floating past. Concerned there may have been an accident, he quickly went and checked it out. However, there was no one on board, so he towed it back to Poco. We were planning to leave early the next morning for Bristol, about 7 miles north of Newport, to watch their famous parade. We contacted the Coast Guard and the harbour master to report the unmanned and unmarked dinghy. No one claimed it, so we had a successful salvage. The weather on the holiday Monday was yuck, lots of rain and a little windy. We arrived and anchored off Bristol and went ashore to watch the parade. It is the oldest parade in the US, and bands from all over the country turn up for the honour of marching. It lasted 5 hours. The rain, however, spoilt the occasion. It was a real shame for all the visiting school bands. Connaught Marina at Portsmouth, where we waited for the next day's lift out. We had a busy week to put the boat to bed and pack for our trip to the UK for Emily's graduation. It was great to catch up with all our family and friends in the UK after a year away, and a very proud moment when Emily received her scroll as a physiotherapist. We returned from the UK with some dreadful virus and both felt rather unwell, but couldn't let this delay our work schedule on the boat. After working solidly for about 2 weeks, the boat was finally ready to go back in the water. We could resume our travels. The 150-mile trip from Newport to New York was uneventful. There were a few stops that we wanted to make. They included Mystic and a trip up the Connecticut River. Mystic was a lovely surprise. We anchored about a mile outside and took the dinghy ashore. Our main aim was to have a pizza at the restaurant made famous by Julia Roberts in her film Mystic Pizza. This was delicious and definitely warranted the slogan, "A little bit of heaven." The boardwalk along the riverfront of this delightful town leads to the Mystic Seaport Museum, which was picturesque and full of nauticalia. Visiting yachts can stay here, but we chose to anchor outside. From here we went to Essex, Connecticut, just inside the entrance to the Connecticut River. This river is navigable into the heart of the state and is unspoiled with very little industrialisation. Much of the banks are national park. We set off up the river and travelled 25 miles past wooded banks, rocky outcrops and picturesque villages. The scary thing was negotiating the numerous bridges and overhead cables. There is a mixture of bascule bridges, where part of the bridge hinges up to the near vertical, lifting bridges, where a whole section of the bridge moves vertically, swing bridges, where a section of the bridge rotates on the horizontal axis, and fixed bridges, which don't move and need to be high enough for us to pass under. The moving bridges are operated by tenders who you contact via VHF. Amazingly, they generally prioritise river traffic over car traffic. We returned to Hamburg Cove, where we met Sunset, who had seen us in Hadley Harbour over 2 months earlier. The evening was warm and gentle, so it was nice to share a sundowner with Linda and Rod. After this, we had an invigorating swim in the fresh water of this delightful spot. After topping up our fuel tank, we then set off the 70-mile trip to New York. We had a great sail with a pleasant breeze that allowed us to fly the Jenica most of the way. We anchored on the way overnight at Milford, apparently famous for its oysters, but Keith didn't try any. As we sailed down Long Island Sound, we heard a call on the VHF Channel 16, the emergency VHF channel, advising that there was an unmanned vessel going round in circles and requesting assistance. The caller described the location as just off Highway 95 at Naugatuck Bridge. The Coast Guard responded, asking their usual catalogue of questions. How many people are on board? Are they wearing their life jackets? What is the lat long of the vessel? Do they have emergency assistance insurance? This catalogue of questions had amused and dismayed us all the way down the East Coast. If the vessel had emergency insurance, they were immediately advised to contact them for assistance. We never heard an instance where the Coast Guard actually responded to a call. The call continued. There are no people on board. There are people in the water, and the motorboat is circling them. Yes, they are wearing life jackets. Can you please come and rescue them? What is the lat long of the vessel? I don't know. It's in the water below Naugatuck Bridge, just off Highway 95. Well, what is your lat long? I don't know. This is Traffic Patrol Vehicle 898 on the bridge. Can you please come and rescue them? Now, considering that the VHF radio has a range less than 25 odd miles, the Coast Guard must have been able to identify where the people were. Coast Guard continues. Say again, how many people are on board? The Highway Patrol officer sounded more and more agitated. None now. They've managed to reach the shore, but the vessel is still going round in circles and is a danger to navigation. Can you please come and rescue the vessel? The Coast Guard repeated their spiel. How many people are on board? Are they wearing their life jackets? There was a long silence, and then a different voice came over the VHF. Coast Guard, this is Stratford Fireboat. Do you want us to attend? The Coast Guard responded with audible relief. Yes, please. Highly amused, we continued our glorious sail down Long Island Sound to New York, arriving late and anchoring to the north of City Island for the night. But that's a story for another day.